have such a big crowd here. Of course, we've got the very popular Roger Saul, who I'll introduce. We're delighted that you're here with us. We're also pleased that we're actually live streaming this so that people, grad students, sign in to watch it. And if all of our technology has worked out well, our good friend Matt Rogers is joining us with his class at Acadia University. So we welcome them to this session as well. I get to do a few of the little list of items that the washrooms are down the hall at either end. If you need to leave early, please exit by the back door so that you don't walk in the middle of the filming and disrupt Roger. And we want to invite you to join us following this for a reception that'll be held down in the faculty lounge, room 225 maybe, something like that. You'll be able to smell the water and cookies. I don't know what's going to be there. But it's a treat, okay? And so please come down and join us and talk to each other and take a few goodies home if you can't eat them right now. And it's a chance also to talk with Roger following his presentation. So we're really pleased that Roger's able to do this talk this evening. Roger is a fairly new member of the faculty, having joined us. He'd been at Brock University prior to coming here, and we're absolutely thrilled to have him here. As you know, he teaches the 50/70 course, which is history, philosophy, sociology, and law course. It's one of the foundations courses, but also has a real interest in all kinds of ways that society is reflected in education and how education reflects things in society. And he's going to talk to us about one of those tonight when he talks about the influence of Hollywood. And so we're really pleased to have you here, Roger, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks everyone for being here. It almost feels like class, lots of students here, and some professors too. I appreciate you coming out. Just want to thank a couple of people before I start. Catherine Foster, who did a lot of organizing and promoting for this event. In fact, a lot of you are here. I just want to thank her for that. There's a lot going on campus tonight too, so that you chose to come here, I appreciate that. And then Amelia Thorpe-Grossley in the corner, who helped me with the graphic design of this PowerPoint. And I say that, which is going to make you think there's some sophisticated graphic design. There isn't, there's just movie stills up, which I couldn't quite get together. So when you see those, just think that was Amelia. So, the title of the talk today is called The Hollywood Syllabus. Hello, how are you? My students will know anytime somebody comes into a class, I lose my train of thought and I must greet them and say hello. Here's someone else. Okay, called The Hollywood Syllabus. And basically I watched a lot of Hollywood films over the last while, depicting schooling. And what I want to do tonight is tell you about some of what I saw. And I want to convince you that paying attention to popular cultural representations of education matter. And the reason they matter is because when you watch popular cultural representations of education, you can figure out all sorts of things about what the society that consumes and produces those representations values. So when we watch representations of education, these are a way into talking about movies and to talking about what the society that produces them and consumes them values. So here's what I did. 5 points of this method. Methods are never this linear and exact, but let's pretend that it is for this next 30 minutes. Basically, I watched a lot of movies depicting schooling, I just told you. Point number 2, I read a lot of scholarly work from others who've done the same. Point number 3, I started to see recurring patterns in a lot of the movies I watched. And I started to get curious about those patterns. Why do so many patterns reoccur in Hollywood movies? I concentrated on the post-war years until the present, and I felt like I kept seeing the same stories over and over again. So I isolated what I refer to as 6 tropes, which means 6 overarching themes, 6 kinds of stories we see over and over again when we watch movies about education. And the stress is on popular movies, movies that have been successful, movies that have been supported by the Hollywood machine. So not necessarily independent films, where there's a much different picture of what's going on with education. I isolated 6 tropes, and this is in bold because I want to spend the presentation talking to you about these 6 tropes, these 6 stories we see over and over again when we talk about education in film. Just 3 little notes about what this study isn't. It isn't a rigid content analysis. Hello, how are you? Stranger. Don't even know who that is. Okay. This isn't a rigid content analysis, so I'm not interested in sort of mathematically deducing exact frequencies and repetitions of films and that sort of thing. What I'm interested in doing is sort of a cultural studies take on this. I'm interested in isolating these themes just as vehicles, as objects of analysis that can open up broader thinking about education. So it doesn't encompass all movies, but it encompasses a whole lot of them. I wasn't able to watch all movies about education from the post-war period on, but I watched a lot of them. And it doesn't encompass all possible themes, because anybody who does any educational or any research knows anytime you have data, your relationship to that data comes with a perspective and a bias. We work with what the data gives us, but we also make all sorts of decisions about what we want to do with that data. So I believe in my themes. I have composed 6 themes, but they're not scientifically verifiable. I just encourage you to judge the veracity of what I say based on the plausibility of the arguments. But on to the 6 tropes. So 6 post-war tropes, 6 kinds of stories we see about education over and over again. I'm going to call the first thematic arch the unruly subjects. Subjects having a double entendre, meaning unruly students. Second overarching theme, the hero teacher. We see hero teachers over and over again in movies. The third one I'm calling saving the quote-unquote others. I'll explain that when we get to it. The fourth one I'm calling the horrors of school socialization. The fifth one, archetypal teens and the quest for belonging. And the 6th one, survival of the fittest. So what I'm going to do with each of these themes is bring them through sort of 3 levels of analysis. I'm going to share with you some examples of that theme. I'm going to then share with you the syllabus. Maybe I'll just get this up. Share some film examples, share the syllabus, sort of an overt reading of what these films are telling us. Then I want to ask some lingering questions about that syllabus. And these questions are not meant to be neutral. They're loaded questions. They're questions with an agenda. They're questions designed to make us be suspicious of the syllabus, right? Okay, so the unruly subjects. Basically, we have a lot of movies representing schooling where kids are just mean and nasty. And we tend to like to consume those films over and over again. So we see in the top left corner the iconic Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean film. So this comes at a moment of sort of moral panic about an emerging leisure class and youth class, all sorts of young people with disposable income and lots of time on their hands, and what might they get involved in? And they get involved in some bad stuff. 187, Samuel Jackson film from 1997. I think it's his first film as a headliner, which, who cares, but just popped into my head.
Very interesting.
But the plot of the film is, the narrative arc is basically he works in the school system in New York, and he's violently assaulted by a student. He then leaves the profession, feels unsupported by the administration, and he relocates to a school in California as a substitute teacher. And at that school, he again runs into bad kids and then decides to take vengeance on them in very violent ways. So 187 is the police code for murder. The substitute, Tom Berenger, he's a federal agent who has to infiltrate a school. This is also a 90s movie. Infiltrate a school to bust up a drug ring. Also very violent towards students. And the last one, a lot of you may have seen 21 Jump Street from 2012. This has a more postmodern sensibility, maybe because of the year. So it's it's also a movie about police to go into a school to bust up a drug ring, but it's a little more self-referential. It's like a high school movie that knows it's a high school movie, so makes fun of some of the tropes. But much more than these are just some snippets that I showed for this theme. But basically, what is the syllabus? So point number 1, mentioned young people in schools are delinquent and volatile. 2 interesting studies here, one from Susanna Stern in a mass media journal. She calls her article self-absorbed, dangerous, and disengaged. She actually did do a rigid content analysis about movies from the late 90s to early 2000s. She watched a bunch of these depicting teenage life, and she found that overwhelmingly young people are represented as self-absorbed, dangerous, and disengaged. And she even makes the bigger inference that when we think of teenagers, we often think of them with a pejorative in mind. They're lazy, they're disengaged, and so on. And she tries to draw a link between the popular cultural representation and our own perceptions. But this may be the most interesting study about this kind of thing I've ever read, by Eamon Nolly and Tyra, called Obsession with the Dark Side of Adolescence. My reading of that study is basically, these authors are saying, let's not let ourselves off the hook too much and saying this is just in the domain of popular culture. These folks studied 6 human development journals from 1985 to 1995 and isolated every representation, every study of adolescence they could find in these development journals. And what they found was a huge negativity bias in terms of what we study when we study young people. So it's not that the science is bad. There's a nuance here. What they're saying is science, you may presume it's neutral or objective or whatever, but the questions we ask before we do the science always come from our imagination, right? They're always self-generated. And what they're saying is we ask a lot of negative questions about adolescents before we ever study them, right? We don't operate from a strength-based approach. We operate from a deficit-based approach. So we ask negative questions, we get negative answers, then we form policy and so on about these negativities. But we could have asked different questions, that's the point. Okay, point 2, poor racial minority and ethnic minority young people are especially delinquent. We see a lot of movies about bad kids, and these 2 studies say that. My film viewing certainly bears it out. There's a certain kind of bad kid that we consume much more often. Poor racial minority and ethnic minority young people. 3, teaching young people is an act of near impossibility, requiring acts ranging from extreme heroism to extreme negligence. I'll talk about heroism in a second, but negligence, it's some of the examples I just mentioned. The solution is to get rougher with kids in these movies. If we could only be more strict and rougher, they'd fall in line. 4th, young people are predatory, teachers and administration are prey. And the last, schools are failing institutions. Some lingering questions. Why do we so often favor these impoverished conceptions of young people? Another one, how do these depictions influence our real life conceptions of them? So that's theme number 1. Let's get to number 2, which is maybe my favorite one, the hero teacher. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, we have a ton of films that construct teachers as unambiguous heroes, but not the kinds of heroes we might associate with real heroism as educators. You know, the sort of dedicated, long-standing commitment to young people, relationship building, and so on. The kinds of heroes we see are completely cartoonish. They're people who stand up on tables and rip up books, who are great orators, who kind of go against the system and change it based on the force of their personality. So some examples here. 1955 Blackboard Jungle, starring Glenn Ford, Mr. Daddier, the teacher, and Sidney Poitier, who's the student. But basically this film, and lots of these films, have a sort of same camera work. You see a teacher happen upon a broken, dilapidated school. They see it in the, you see it in the background, and you suddenly realize that they're going to enter this school and they're going to try to fix it. And that's the story. The stories of them fixing the school through their heroism. Maybe the most famous representation of this is To Sir With Love. How many of students have seen this? How many professors have seen this? It always comes back to, for all the nuance, it's all about, Okay, so here, the Sidney Poitier character's from, I think he's from British Guyana, by way of California, ends up in East London and has to sort of, his task is to fix the situation with bad kids in his school.
You've got to read the little subtitle up at
What
the
does
top.
it say?
Story as fresh as the girls in their minis,
Oh, right.
and as cool as their teacher had to be.
There's actually like a way too long dance scene at the end of that film. It feels like it lasts 10 minutes of people just dancing in their minis.
In their miniskirts.
Okay, Dead Poets Society, a very different kind of school, a sort of upper class school where kids are extremely privileged. And the Robin Williams character comes in and sort of teaches them to love education again. They're tired of their sort of rote, rigid education, and he offers them something different. And then Dangerous Minds, Ex-Marine. How many people have seen that one? Okay, Michelle Pfeiffer comes to a quote-unquote bad school, and she's the hero. So, great teachers are of one character type in particular. They're heroes. Second thing, a great teacher must usually go it alone. There is an implicit judgment of the rest of the school system whenever we see these films. There is one great teacher who runs into a bunch of inept teachers, inept administrators, and so on. So to elevate the hero, the rest of the school is painted with a very, very sort of ugly brush, right? We know as educators that the way to be successful in a school with our colleagues and so on is to form communities, right? To learn to rely on others, to trust others, and so on. This is a radical argument for individualism, these kinds of films, right? Everybody else has got it wrong, I'm going to do it myself. A great teacher's obstacles are the following in these films: their colleagues, their school's administration, their curriculum, their students' parents, the pull of their lives outside of school, and their students for a time until they convert them, right? That's always the hero teacher's obstacles, everything. That's what it takes to be a great teacher. You have to come up against all those things. Last one, a great teacher usually has little teaching experience or is not really a teacher. It's always somebody who happens upon a school who just has a career change and gets inspired to be a teacher, or has just come out of teacher's college. But this is a real indictment of the work of teachers, right? It's never a teacher who's 2 years in or 5 years in or 10 years in. It's always got to be an outsider who fixes the situation, right? So lingering questions. Why is the hero teacher so often an outsider? What kinds of pressures do these films leave educators with? I talk to a lot of students and working teachers who've become teachers because they've identified with these heroes. This leads into the third question. Can't you be a great teacher without being that kind of hero? And I'm asking all these questions hoping they come up in the question talk afterwards, right? How does the elevation of hero teachers affect our perception of other teachers, right? All the other teachers have to be bad for the hero teacher to be good. Where does community appear in these films? Very loaded question. It does not. And what does it mean that we're excited about teacher heroism when we see it? And that's maybe the most uncomfortable question for us. We recognize this intellectually, but emotionally, we watch these films and we identify with these hero teachers. Summer class I was in with Malcolm and some others, we watched Dead Poets Society with all this critical language, and half of us were in tears, right? So something to pick up on later. Third one, saving the others. So let's go to the examples first. We have Freedom Writers and Dangerous Minds, two movies that are kind of the same. A teacher comes into usually a white privileged teacher comes into a school with non-white children and has to fix them up and uplift them. There's a subtext of charity here, right? Music of the Heart, Meryl Streep in an inner city school who starts a music program for poor young kids. And then The Principal, a bit more of an absurd kind of one. It's James Belushi, you see him there with the baseball bat. And he's going to fix up this school and save it. So, the syllabus. Teaching bad kids is a messianic project. There is a sort of religious undertone here. We have to save and uplift these poor kids. Bad kids need to be not worked with. It feels like saved, tamed, even domesticated in a certain way, right? Syllabus point number 2. The way to save bad kids is to teach them to endorse the dominant culture. It's always that. You have to teach them to fall in line with how the school system is. There's no acknowledgement of, why are these kids bad, or why do you think they're bad in the first place, or so on. You always have to bring them into the dominant culture. So you have to bring them in line with middle class ideals. Meritocracy, individualism, socioeconomic uplift through hard work. We know sociologically that it's fact. Kids from working class backgrounds have a tougher time in schools than kids from middle class and up backgrounds. And a good teacher knows this and should pay attention to this. The lesson here is about, again, radical individualism. There's not really an accounting of that. It's more a blame the victim. Everybody's got to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. Interestingly, like when you see Dead Poets Society and Freedom Writers or Dangerous Minds, both of those, Dead Poets Society's rich kids, Dangerous Minds is poor kids, both groups have to be brought into middle class values. That's the idea. The kids in Dead Poets Society are seen as having unseen privilege. They have to be brought into these middle class values. The poor kids in the other films I mentioned also have to be brought into these middle class values. And to teach, so the way to save bad kids is to teach them to be better at following school rules. So this leads to the third syllabus point. although it often masks itself as the opposite, saving the others implies a radical endorsement of the school system as is. They feel like rebellion films, the teacher who goes off the curriculum, who does something different. But the goal at the end is to get a good grade on the test, right? It's to endorse the dominant culture. So it's almost, it feels like rebellion, but it's really an endorsement of the status quo. That's the teacher's task in these films. And students who most often need conversion are racial, ethnic, economically marginalized students. I feel like we see that again and again. Some lingering questions. What kinds of long-standing social forces animate these teacher as savior fantasies? Think of the assimilationist history of schooling in Canada or the United States. This is a sort of historical precedent here, and this is playing out in all sorts of ways in these films, right? We have to save the others, the non-dominant. What kinds of educational forces animate that? Okay, this is maybe another one of the ones I really like. The horrors of school socialization. I'm just gonna take it. Okay, so kids who get together in schools, they're not just bad to teachers, they're often incredibly mean to each other. And there's a whole subset of these that of course involve girls, right? And the operative point here, syllabus point 1, girlhood is pathological. That's what these films seem to teach us. Adolescent girls are mean, they're cruel, they're vindictive, and they're tribal. So a classic of this genre is 1976 film Carrie, that adaptation of the 1974 Stephen King novel. Basically, Carrie is this teenage girl who's teased mercilessly by her peers, but she develops telekinetic powers. And she starts to learn how to harness these. And then the apex of this is her prom, where she's fooled into thinking she's become the prom queen. It's all suddenly better, but as she approaches the stage, you realize the bad kids have, or we realize beforehand, the bad kids have conspired to trick her into thinking she was the prom queen. They dump pig's blood on her head, and then she turns the prom into a horror show using her telekinetic powers. There's a certain innocence here because in the history since, with lots of school shootings and so on, it's kind of like uncomfortable to watch. Although when it was made in the 70s, there's a sort of innocence to this
There's
depiction.
a remake.
Right, 2013 remake, which has anybody that haven't seen that?
Not good.
Not good.
Nothing as good as the first one.
Next one is Mean Girls. So a classic. So the Lindsay Lohan character has been homeschooled. She gets to school. She has to suddenly arrive at a formal school, and she has to adjust to how formulaic, how ritualistic school life is, and of course it is. She sort of falls in with a few different cliques. First, some outcasts, and then some cool girls called the Plastics. You guys can help me out with this. And the school comes apart because, of course, Lindsay Lohan character, who befriends the Plastics, suddenly starts warring with the lead Plastic. And the reason she starts warring with her is because of a boy. What else would adolescent girls possibly fight about but a boy, right? And then we're also made to understand, like, the worst thing Lindsay Lohan does to the lead Plastic girl is she gives her a nutrition bar and tells her it's a low-calorie nutrition bar, but it's really a high-calorie nutrition bar. And so the girl starts gaining weight slowly, because that's the meanest thing you could do to another girl, is to make her gain weight, right? I'm being facetious here, but the point is this is sort of what we're asked to do in the film, to follow along with. I want to be careful here, because the film's intended as a comedy. It's intended to, like, amuse us. So I always have a sort of pet peeve of cultural critics or scholars who criticize a cultural artifact or something it was never supposed to be in the first place. So I don't want to pick on Mean Girls for that reason, but it's sort of emblematic of a lot of films that do the same things, and that's why I feel like it gives me a right to pick on it, because I'm picking on this sort of genre, if I'm allowed to. Saved is just a sort of religious take on some Mean Girls and other things. And then 13, a little bit outside the Hollywood machine, but it's, and very critically acclaimed, but it's pretty much about a good girl. Has anybody seen that? Evan Rachel Wood? A good girl who meets a bad girl and starts being very bad, engaging in risk-taking behavior and so on. The thing about 13 though is there's the sense that I think we're supposed to take away, girls left to their own devices will do bad things. We have to protect them in some way, right? We're supposed to be scared for this girl who's been influenced by this man. Okay, syllabus points. Girls are especially pathological in groups. Girls alone, you see all sorts of redemptive moments and sensitivity and so on. Girls in groups, forget about it. They're going to be mean to each other, right? The moral life of adolescent girls is impoverished. Girls are in need of our protection. Who is our? I don't know. Adulthood, patriarchy, but we get the sense they're in need of our protection. And then the fourth one, to a similar extent, many young people will be mean to each other in schools if left to their own devices. This is not just about girls. Lots of young people are mean to each other in these films, and we like to consume these. These films make a lot of money and so on. It seems especially so for girls. Lingering questions. If we substituted girlhood for another social marker, would we be as accepting of these representations? I think about if we changed girlhood and had people act the same way, but based on a different social characteristic, I think we'd be outraged. It's so normalized with girls, we accept it and think it's funny, I think. Where do diverse expressions of gender appear, let alone expressions of gender nonconformity? I don't see that being produced so much by the Hollywood machine. And is the truth about high school moral life hidden in these socialization discourses? Of course, it's not the case that girls are not mean to each other in groups sometimes, but the point is the deeper inquiry. Why? What kind of hierarchies and structural forces in schools help to create that? Okay, two more. Archetypal teens in the quest for belonging. For 80s movies fans, this is this can be known as the John Hughes category, right? The idea here is teens fit into very sort of neat, fixed, subcultural prototypes, right? So an iconic one here is Breakfast Club. 5 kids have to spend a detention at school on a Saturday, and each kid represents a different sort of prototype. There's the nerd, the cool kid, the outcast, the jock, and so on. So we have a lot of films that fix adolescents into these specific kinds of categories. Breakfast Club tries to be a little bit more complicated than that and show an interior life to these people, but I think it sort of reinscribes the categories in trying to do so. There's Can't Buy Me Love. Has anybody seen that? Young Patrick Dempsey. I think there's a remake of an all-African-American cast a couple of years ago that came out about this. But basically, the Patrick Dempsey character is a nerd. We're made to understand he's a nerd. He mows lawns. He saves up his money because he wants to buy a telescope. But then I think he's at the mall one day and he sees a popular girl who needs money because she accidentally spilled something on her mother's dress or something like that. So he convinces the popular girl, I'll use my money, if I'll pay you and you pretend to be my girlfriend for a little while so that I can experience life as a popular kid, right? And then hilarity ensues, right? And then look to 1985, a big year for Michael J. Fox. Teen Wolf and Back to the Future. Teen Wolf, basically, Michael J. Fox is a sort of middling teen who discovers he's a werewolf and then becomes popular. These things are always, when you rewatch them, so interesting. Like I realized the werewolf thing's a giant metaphor for puberty. Like he's looking in the mirror one day and he sees there's hair in strange places and he freaks out. But then he sees that his father's also got the hair in strange places and then he feels okay. Right. Same with Carrie though, the telekinetic powers. I think it's supposed to be her new powers of womanhood. Okay. And then Back to the Future. Michael J. Fox goes back in time and relives these social hierarchies in school of his parents and then has to sort of fix them. By far of all the categories, I felt like this was the biggest in terms of slotting films into. The syllabus, point number 1, teens best fit into neat and uncomplicated subcultural prototypes. We're comfy with the nerd and the jock and this. There's no sense of more complication than that. And of course we know there's much more complication than that, even as these groups exist in our own school lives. The dominant task of adolescence is to achieve popularity. That is the dominant task. That's what young people are often trying to do in these films, to achieve popularity. And the price of achieving popularity, humiliation, compromise, cruelty, is always worth it. I should say is often worth it, maybe overstating. And then point 4, overly privileged teens get to be young. It strikes me as interesting that these sort of middle-class teens get to find themselves and have identity crisis and come of age and so on. When you see the struggling teens, the poor teens, racial minority teens, they don't have that privilege of having to find themselves. We always see them in a sort of different narrative arc. So lingering question, to what extent does the language of the teen archetypes precede the experience of being young? It's a bit of a Foucauldian post-structural move here. Is it that we form these groups and then we see them represented on film? Or do we actually take cues from these popular cultural representations and segment ourselves into these groups based on what we see? What comes first? Kind of curious about that. And are there more complicated ways of understanding what it means to be young? Okay, last of these themes. How am I doing on time?
Great.
What does that mean? All right, so I've got this theme, I've got a quick sum up, and then we'll have a chat. Okay, so this is the subculture, the subtext is sports films. There are a lot of high school sports films, but I think the high school sports films are really about school and rendering school values and sort of rigid school values intelligible to us. So there's Friday Night Lights in the upper left-hand corner, which is a great TV show if I memorialize for a second, but that's the film. So a small town in Texas that's sort of obsessed with their football team. Fame, 1980s performing arts school. Hoosiers, Indiana basketball, starring Gene Hackman, and then He Got Game, about a fractured relationship between a father and his son, Denzel Washington and Ray Allen, set against the backdrop of a highly recruited basketball player who's getting all sorts of attention from universities for scholarships. Maybe just go quickly through this. I think school sports, as we see them in film, are often a mechanism for rendering the competitive aspects of schooling intelligible to us. In other words, school sports are highly competitive spaces, but we're also made to understand that schools are highly competitive spaces. Schools and school sports are unforgiving spaces of triumph and demise, and maybe in schools the fittest survive. For here, question's a bit different. Is this the one trope, the one overarching theme where art best imitates life? Is this the one trope where movies really get it right? It does feel often to me as if schools are extremely hierarchical spaces, extremely competitive spaces, where at every level you're being assessed, who raised their hand first, who lined up the best, who got to the next grade, who got to high school, who got to the best university. Is this sort of constant assessment. Maybe these films are getting something right about that. And then all the other stuff, and what other sphere do we rise and fall at the sound of a bell? Are we rewarded for being quiet or moving from point A to point B in a straight line? And so on and so forth. We have to raise our hand to ask to go to the washroom. If these are public schools, and yet we form these hierarchies where lots of people find themselves on the bottom end of these hierarchies, what does it mean about how we conceptualize public schools? There's public supposed to be for everyone. Maybe these stark realities in these films are actually telling us something that's true about schools. Okay, last slide. Why do these films have such enduring appeal? 3 thoughts, and I guess I believe less the first one, and as we move to the last one, that's the one I believe most. One way to come at this is to say these kinds of films have appeal because they're fun, and it's not more complicated than that. Roger, why are you analyzing this so much? They're just fun movies. I see a lot of knowing looks on my classes about all sorts of subjects. Why are we analyzing? Can't we just? That to me sidesteps the question. If they're fun, why have we chosen these representations of fun? If it's just supposed to be, why haven't we chosen other ones as fun? The reason that we've chosen these ones are fun, there's a reason for that. I don't know what it is, but it's not an accident that these are the stories we like over and over again. Point number 2, these kinds of films offer us ways to digest a complex organism with some simplicity. It reminds me of Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher and cultural critic, talking about the movie Jaws and what Jaws signifies. Right? Jaws, the shark, stands in for all our social fears and insecurities. That's why such a successful villain. We can displace everything that bothers us into this very simple figure of an angry shark. Right? He's like a universal villain. Maybe there's an aspect of that going on with schools too, where this is so complex, the questions are so great that we fall into these familiar narratives to give us some sort of comfort and simplicity in relation to how difficult school life can be. Maybe these films tap into both a big truth and a big lie, kind of falls to both these. The big truth, maybe these films get something right about an emotional truth. I mean, let's be honest, teaching is difficult. Standing in front of a room of full of people is not easy. We don't always know how we're doing. Sometimes kids are bad to us. They make our lives difficult and so on. Sometimes things don't go so great. Do we have spaces to talk about that kind of stuff? What we talk about a lot in my class is that, there's this sort of discourse of positivity that a lot of us in the teaching profession are wedded to. We have to say everything's going great and everything's going fine and so on. We get seen as a certain kind of person if we don't hold on to that narrative. But maybe we need spaces to talk about, honest reactions and interpretations and engagements with school. So point 3, and sort of saying that in what I just said, these kinds of films conflate what feel like emotional truths about education with what feel like inauthentic, exaggerated, problematic scenarios. And maybe that's what we're doing. We're creating some emotional truth and we're lapping them on to some stories we've gotten used to. And maybe I'll just read this final thought and stop there. If we find ourselves relying on these particular films, often problematic in their depictions, to experience and negotiate emotional truths about institutional experiences most of us have in common, maybe this reliance suggests a need unmet for additional spaces to do so. Maybe we need these films. It is a signal that we're not creating enough spaces in our own professional lives to have these conversations. And maybe, if anything, these films point us towards doing that. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
Some time for questions and discussion. In addition to the folks in the room, I believe that Catherine will be passing on the questions from Matt's class.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the slide with the Mean Girls? Yeah. So the question, the first one there that you asked, if we substituted girlhood for another social marker, would we be as accepting of these representations? Could you give a couple examples of other social markers there? I'm just curious.
So if we represented a particular religion as always engaging in this kind of meanness in groups towards each other, or a racial group, or an ethnicity, would we tolerate that? I think we'd be outraged. In groups and out groups would be outraged. When it's about girls, it's kind of, yeah, that's okay.
Okay, sure. I was just curious what your other examples would apply. Thank you.
Roger, what? I mean, I don't know if I asked you this at your job talk or not, but what in the heck got you into this stuff?
Getting to watch movies and pretending it's research. You know what? That might be a sort of honest answer.
For many years at UBC, I taught Giroux's Is Disney Good for Your Kids? And I have students probably 10, 15 years later who still haven't forgiven me for making them read the article. How do you then go forward with your students to have them look critically at the things that they hold so dear to their hearts?
I think that's an excellent question. And
Can you repeat
thank
what
you.
Amanda said? 'Cause I didn't really
Sorry,
know.
yeah. So I used to teach Giroux's why is Disney good for your kids? So I have students 10 years later who still don't forgive me for introducing them to that article, who say I've ruined their love of something that was so deeply ingrained in their systems. Disney is untouchable. And so how do you then go forward with your students when they get angry at you in some ways for teaching them to be critical of the things that are core?
They love, right?
Yeah.
Robert Munch.
Yeah, Munch.
Dr. Seuss, Berenstain Bears.
So here's my confession. I love a lot of these films. I wouldn't have sat there and watched a bunch of them if I didn't. I think our task, to answer Amanda's question, is we have to hold these two things together. We have to learn to be critical of things we love, and we have to hold together the complication of it, because that's what we're all living. I was talking to Dave about a film I saw last year about, I think it was called The Yes Men, about a bunch of guys who do sort of corporate practical jokes. I think that's where I saw this, but one of the things they did was they would deface billboards, but in artistic ways. And I think there was a Marlboro or there was a billboard of something else, and they made the person, or it was a Marlboro billboard, and they defaced it in some ways to kind of attack Marlboro, the cigarette company. But as the guy was telling the people, the camera, what he'd done, he was smoking a Marlboro cigarette, talking about having to face, and I thought that was perfect in answer to Amanda's question. He realizes he's implicated in the same systems he's criticizing. This comes from the Gap, I think. Do I approve of all of what I know about how they make their clothes and so on? Of course not. I'm implicated in the systems I'm criticizing. I have to learn to live with that.
Okay. I'm just going to ask a question, a follow-up question. So this is from Dr. Matt Rogers, Social Studies and Foundation classes at Acadia University. And they want to know, did you find films or other examples that disrupted or resisted the 6 frames of students and teachers? And what did they do differently?
The one I was talking about with Justin that comes to mind is a film called Half Nelson. I think Catherine said she hated it. But this is a film.
I did at the lunch table without realizing that I was saying.
This is a film that totally inverts. There are a lot of films that totally. I'm working with sort of broad consistencies, but of course lots of exceptions make the rule. Half Nelson's about pretty much a student who kind of needs to save a teacher from himself. I just wrote a book chapter about a TV series called The Wire that I feel like best fits within a history of film, but it's a TV show that sort of plays a trick on us. We think we're going to see the hero teacher, and we see something else entirely that makes us ask all sorts of interesting questions. So lots of these exist, but I'm interested in the fact that these are the successful ones. Everybody's seen Mean Girls. A couple of people have seen The Wire. Why is that?
It's not exactly about film, but it's about a category you use in this. What is popularity?
I guess I'm operating with it. I hate definitions on the spot in front of a group of people on YouTube. Thank you, Dave. Popular, when a mass, what is a mass? A mass of people coalesce to elevate something to a status that they agree meets a certain point of elevation.
A recursive description of a person.
Cultural capital.
Could be. I'm not satisfied with either that or yours. Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about this for years, and I've been thinking myself.
Yeah.
When my daughters talk about kids being popular, I wonder. I've asked them what does that mean?
I think it's just a lot of people think that one person's popular. So it's like, oh, they think they're popular.
Yeah.
Well, I think they're
Okay,
popular.
so how about an interpretive community decides that one person or group of people decides on a definition of one person or group of people that elevates them to some sort of social status, cultural capital, or whatever.
So it's outside of the person who's popular, the description of popularity.
I believe so.
So you can't choose to become popular then, because it's others that do it to you.
Yeah, I can't choose to be 7 feet tall. Yeah.
But what is that then? And it's based on criteria or characteristics that the group determines to be status invoking, or
Yes.
Yeah. So
And ask around in high schools. In some schools, for some reason, the popular group is the smart kids. In others, it's the athletes.
Yeah.
And of course, more schools, it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, an interpretive
Yeah,
community
certain-
decides what it is, and it's
Yeah.
variable definition.
Yeah, so certain criteria that they determine to be, I can't think of the word right now, accessible, achievable, desirable, which I think reflects sort of broader social values and mores as well.
Yeah, I don't think it's divorced from broader social values at all. Right?
I think there was a hand on the back. It's been up for a while.
I'm interested in boys, boyhood being pathological. Did you see films that fit that descriptor? I'm thinking of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. However, that bad boy, good boy thing, like, you know, he's so bad, he's good.
Yeah. Sure. There are lots of depictions of pathological boyhood, and I don't know if Ferris Bueller would be one I'd go directly toward, but yeah, the social construction of masculinity. I mean, I think we could make a broader umbrella of youth and adolescence, and the pejoratives attached to that, and they're attached differently for males and females. But I think there are pathologies attached to both, sure. But maybe a privileged pathology when it's attached to
I'm
boyhood.
thinking that boys, the rebel, the, rule breaker, yet being perceived as heroic, as opposed to cruel, vindictive, and mean, like the
Right.
girls are.
Right. Yeah, and of course there's so much more there, even in terms of sexuality. The sexually promiscuous boy versus the sexually promiscuous girl, and how they're elevated differently in terms of popularity. But also the rebellious boy versus the rebellious girl. Gender undercuts this for sure.
The movie Donnie Darko had some pretty mean guys that weren't heroes. I guess they're more bullies.
But if we talk about this enough, we're going to find all sorts of movies that violate these categories. Absolutely. Donnie Darko is a really interesting film. Jose's picking. Yeah. People are like, why aren't you?
Especially the blood so you come down. So my favorite, I was waiting for it to turn up every time, but it turned up only in the girls one, the Prime of Christine Brodie. And the reason I asked is that it could fit into any of your categories, but its main message for me is the incredible influence of a teacher over a set of young minds, and that's not in your list.
I agree. I actually, when I had put a star next to the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie because it's a genre buster. I agree with you. And then I put it there, but you're right. I agree with you about that one. It's on Netflix right now for some reason.
Yeah, Maggie Smith.
Okay, we have one more question from Acadia. And this is, how would you analyze Breaking Bad within these frames?
Breaking Bad is a TV show. I actually stayed away from putting both together because it's an interesting thing with film and movies. The history of this stuff in TV is very different. It's much more sanitized. And the reason, of course, is because there's much, I think, less of an artistic vision in the history of television because of advertisers. You have to present messages in a sanitized version, whereas now TV is becoming more like movies used to be, right? There's the TV auteur. A filmmaker could present a vision through television and cannot do that for movies anymore because that's so corporately controlled now. Breaking Bad, I was obsessed with that. I don't even know where to start with that. My love, The Wire, Breaking Bad, they're both right there. So Breaking Bad is about a chemistry teacher who starts cooking meth with his rebel students, and then we follow them for about 60 hours or something like that. How would I place these within?
Yeah, your frames, your 6.
Let's see. No, maybe a little of this. Survive. No. Maybe a little. No. Yes. The answer is 1, 2, and 5. Right?
Okay.
I guess sort of on that note too, have you ever seen How to Get Away with Murder?
No.
You fit that one there.
I haven't seen it, I don't think.
The law professor with her.
Yeah, she's
The
awesome.
must see Thursday night TV.
Is it on right now?
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's on Netflix first season.
Okay, I was about to say this is Netflix has ruined regular TV for me, but it's on Netflix. I have no excuse. I don't know.
Educating reader, it's not a great one, but that's like.
What's that?
Educating reader. It falls it right into conforming, really, doesn't it? Do you know that one?
No.
Educating Rita, it was a.
Michael Caine.
What year was that?
80s?
Oh, but there was a remake, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so to bring it back to teachers, how do we then take the tropes, present them to the teachers and train teachers who are going out there to teach, and get them to understand their roles in classrooms better, like thinking about like standing on the stop wanting to stand on the table and be the hero teacher, or
We do this. We talk about it. We talk about it, and we negotiate what we see here with what we actually see. I think we talk and we sit and we think. I wish I had a sexier answer for you than that.
Me?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm just interested in your whole point of the hero teacher. So I'm in Roger's class, and we've talked about it before, but how we all come up with that vision of the hero teacher. We've all grown up with it.
Yeah.
So how do we overcome it? Because I guarantee most of us have that in the back of our head of like,
I think, think of our class. I think we're still in that. Remember the first class after your practicum, where like, oh, this is how teaching really is. And I think we had the most honest discussion. I cherished that discussion because we got away from what we try to chip away at. And it's like we know it intellectually. We got away from the heroism thing and talked about sort of real concerns, fears, insecurities. Will these ever go away? And this is why I come back to talk. Like the death of discourse is where we're ruined. We have to keep putting these things into conversation. And it's hard. Of course I want to be the hero. But is that the best expression of education that we can leave each other with? This I'm a hero, does that teach you to love me or to love the subject? Does that matter? Maybe it does.
Roger, I'm thinking that what you're presenting tonight in itself makes a very good lesson for a class, in the sense of I mean, a lot of these films they're stereotypical, in the sense of what they represent, and you've chosen to put them into categories of stereotypes. So in a way, it'd be interesting to set that as an assignment for students to look at a number of films and then categorize it, or to look at the main themes and so on, and do their own analysis. It'd be interesting to come back and see what you would get in terms of a range of comments on it.
Yeah.
And get them to think critically about it, because really, to me, the lesson here is thinking about stereotypes and how the mainstream film industry, of course, feeds us stereotypes because we all flock to films that represent the same topics over and over again. But as an idea, it seems to me to make a really excellent lesson.
At another university, I taught a course called The Adolescent and the Teacher once upon a time, where there was a sort of assignment structure around this, find a popular cultural representation and work it through.
Just kind of along those same lines. I think it's really important to talk about the tropes that are really common in popular culture at the risk of kind of destroying, films and TV shows that your students love, because these films are so linked to how we construct our own experience of adolescence and growing up. Like, we may not even realize that the popular culture that we consume, maybe that's the reason that why I always expected groups of girls to be cruel, and why I felt the need to behave in that way, or I wasn't surprised when others were, or I had these kind of ideas about the way, young boys should be, and what behaviors were acceptable for them and what behaviors were acceptable for me, and what groups are represented, what groups aren't, and what that says about me, and my friends and the people that I grew up with. So yeah, I just think it's important to expose them to that and teach them to kind of think critically about what they're consuming, because it does have a big effect on how they feel about themselves and their community.
Affect matters. We form emotional connections to these films in real ways.
There was another question from Acadia.
Yeah, so the last question from Acadia, which follows up on that, is what kinds of representations of educators and students might be necessary to provide a more productive syllabus?
Acadia questions get to be crafted this way. Not feeling Acadia right now.
The Breaking Bad, that was good.
I think we need to have, we need to engage with flawed teachers and difficulties and fears, all the stuff under the veneer of the positivity discourse, which I think is just not just a problem of popular culture, it's a problem of our profession for educators. Not that you shouldn't be positive, I'm not advocating for cynicism, but that but there's something inauthentic about this veneer of constant positivity. I want to see flaws. You know what? We're all human and we're all flawed, and I want to empathize with someone that way more than through this artificial thing I keep seeing.
I think Philip had a question.
Just about the heroism point and teachers going out, young teachers, pre-service teachers. The movies that I've watched all these too, and especially the hero one. But what really concerns me is that if you go, the hero teachers I know wouldn't know that they were heroes. And they wouldn't know until way after the fact, because Don Bosse, for example, was describing an email he got the other day from a teacher he taught 10 years ago. Or the teachers who don't get all of the acclaim and that kind of thing. Those are often the hero teachers that would never make a 19-minute, movie like Aaron Burrell or Sam Pickering, who's a hero of mine, who is the Robin Williams character in Dead Poets Society. And I think that going out into schools, if you have that lofty ideal or goal of, I want to be a hero, that just doesn't happen. And that teachers are flawed characters, and that teachers every day, if you can just go and make it, it sounds corny, but making a difference in one, or just getting your attendance in on time, or making sure that your units are done and that you are doing the best job you can. The heroism is, we don't get big bonuses as teachers, but maybe to someone somewhere we were a hero.
I think that's a lovely answer to that question.
I asked if they could hear it, and I think they can.
Yeah, on like the topic of like great teachers, the heroes, how was there a theme that went through like the genre of films that was proving your point about the hero teachers? Was there a culture shock in there? Because in order to like be those people, don't they cause rifts? And the culture to go against the school, the norm that's already created in that culture, and to be that difference, how was there a theme that went through the film?
There's a huge rift, and I think again it's an emotional truth that teaching is difficult, it can be thankless, it can be hard, and so there is a rift, but it's blown up in this, I'm going to do it myself, the school's not supporting me, so I'm going to go forward and I'm going to be a hero. So there's always a disruption there. And there might be a grain of truth in that disruption that I feel underappreciated or whatever. But everything that comes after that starts to be things I could pick on, I think, because it's sort of anti-community where I think we need to be pro-community in that sense.
So I think Paula had a question.
No, Philip and I have talked about this before, these hero teachers, and I'm always hesitant to show. We get along most of the time, really. And I think Philip is one of those teachers, to be honest. But I have arguments sometimes with him because I don't want to show I don't want to put that as the thing to reach because I don't think it's attainable and I don't want to scare the living daylights out of people, right? Like, I can't be that. I may as well just give up now, right? But
Yeah.
because I've had those sentiments myself.
Eve's sitting 2 seats ahead of me. He said one day, that talk we had where I said we had an honest conversation, I remember in class he said, well, how do we win? The practicum was hard. There are parts about it I loved, but there was also difficult parts. But how do we win? And then I think Ashley said, I'm like, how do we win? I think we have to reframe the question. It's not winning is what Philip said. It's showing up. It's recognizing that things are going to be difficult. It's committing anyways. That's maybe the heroism. But we don't win in that sense of a cartoonish hero. We win differently. That's what winning means.
And unfortunately, we are out of time. A good spot to end. But there's plenty more time downstairs with food where you can talk some more one-on-one, continue discussion. And if you haven't had nearly enough of Roger's ideas, I would like to put in a plug for the Atlantic Education Graduate Student Conference, which Roger will be the keynote speaker for, July 9th, right here at UNB. So come back in the summer.
We'll be talking about movies that day.
Don't forget to sign in if you haven't already done so for the BN speakers.
And so as Catherine mentioned, the conference this summer is free to attend, so come back. Oh, and we'll be providing free food there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Matt.
I am going to go watch every one of these movies.
Starting with Brodie Kid. Is it important? Not really. Yeah, because you're not going to recognize our voice. No, I thought it was an amazing Costa run.
That was a funny story though. Good job,
Thanks, Roger.
Hey, how are you? But my little guy was actually, I was expecting like 15 words. But he was actually on my duck. And he also told me
I don't have Amelia is going to give you the answer tomorrow. I promise.
Multiple, but also with and also play with today to teach my class favorite channel. And so she's just like, you know, class. Feedback was fantastic. She did it once last term and once this term. They like it. They love And today,
Yeah, for both.
Oh, it's the same people?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can't, I was thinking that there's a group there and you're.
I tell them to.
Okay, so it's the same class.
So same class.
And then next year is. So Brodie went 3 years
I'm hoping I left them in eating
That's to live my life as if I might be
All right.
Because I often have. Well, I encourage you to talk.
And what's considered acceptable or undesirable? There's a hierarchy of
If
things.
you go together because.
History. I figure out how to turn it off.
I can't kill a live stream. Which is okay in the end.
Just as long as nobody comes in and has a smell or a dance and.
It's gonna keep streaming though, it's using our broadband.
Oh, who cares when you matter?
I'll be answering.
Okay.
How do we get the history again? And then what is, okay, let's say,
Okay, well, what can we turn off? If we turn the computer off, would it not turn off? No, we have to log out, because where does?
They look at all these things, we did March this year, we said, it's not like.
Frequent,
It's not obviously, you have to get a certain mark. It's whether, like, they look at whatever the marks are, and then you go from there,
But in terms of being public environment, then the student who's in the school struggling might be required to pay for a private.
Yeah.
More than one. About who your first day and we just don't want to. So go continue your conversation. I just can't. That's fair.
Just shut down the whole room.
We'd like to think so, but we can't, so. I know.
I'm gonna try shutting down and restarting.
Yeah, maybe we'll see.
I don't think that's gonna work, because I think
downstairs and I'll give you my home, so don't.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm gonna attempt to shut down. Oh.
Cut, click.
Because of the Wirecast, it wasn't in YouTube.
It was in what?
Wirecast, something different.
Is it cut?